to go ahead and just, say, I missed that. Can you repeat it or clarify or whatever? So thank you all again for joining us. So today we're going to start by reviewing the history and purpose of the critical area law. Then we'll get into some basic critical area development standards, project review, and completion of some of our forms. We'll also throw in a break so you all can get to the restroom, stretch your legs, get a drink, whatever you need to do. And then we'll end with local government projects and forms. So a little bit about the history of our program. It's based on the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Act, introduced by Governor Harry Hughes in 1984. It is a state program focused on protecting the water quality and habitat of Maryland's bays, and it was prompted by an EPA study of the bay that revealed a variety of sources of problems. And this is kind of a lengthy list, but it includes urban sprawl, polluted stormwater runoff, forest clearing, drainage from agricultural lands, sediment and erosion from construction sites, removal of natural stream buffers, a decline in living resources, particularly oysters, and decreases in habitat such as wetlands, transitional habitat, and submerged aquatic vegetation, which we frequently use the acronym SAV for. Thus, all land within the critical area is now regulated by state law or the local critical area programs. And then the Atlantic coastal bays were added in 2002. So where exactly is the critical area? It includes all tidal waters of the Chesapeake and Atlantic coastal bays, as well as all land within 1,000 feet of tidal waters and tidal wetlands. This equates to over 11% of the state of Maryland, as well as over 5,200 miles of shoreline. So obviously the map that we're looking at is just a portion of the state of Maryland. The counties that are highlighted in green don't have any critical area. All of the counties that do contain critical area are in blue, and then the critical area itself is outlined along the shoreline in yellow. So please forgive me for basically reading this slide to you verbatim, but for the purpose of the law, it's the purpose of the General Assembly in enacting this subtitle to establish a resource protection program for the Chesapeake and the Atlantic coastal bays and their tributaries by fostering more sensitive development activity for certain shoreline areas so as to minimize damage to water quality and natural habitats, and to implement the resource protection program on a cooperative basis between the state and affected local governments, with local governments establishing and implementing their programs in a consistent and uniform manner, subject to state and local leadership, criteria, and oversight. So we have 3 foundational goals in the critical area, and they are to first minimize adverse impacts to water quality from runoff. Second, conserve fish, wildlife, and plant habitat. And third, to establish land use policies that both accommodate growth while also addressing the fact that the number, movement, and activities of people in the critical area can have adverse environmental impacts. So local critical area programs, this is where all of you come in. COMAR spells out the regulations to fulfill the goals of the law, but they're also included in all of your local programs, whether that's a county code, a zoning ordinance, what have you. Each of our jurisdictions is responsible for implementing their local program approved by the commission. Most of our original programs were approved in the late 80s and early 90s and have since been updated to keep up with our revised and updated state regulations. For the most part, development approvals and enforcement actions occur at the local level, so that's with you. However, our commission staff focuses on working with our individual jurisdictions to develop local alternatives for local needs. So this is why we might say, if somebody poses a question, that the answer to that question depends on the local jurisdiction's language. So I'm going to take a brief pause here and ask if anyone wants to volunteer with an example that they think is maybe specific to their jurisdiction. Sounds like maybe not. Whoops, just fast forwarded way too much. So one example that I can think of that would apply to this group is in Dorchester County. I think this is more unique to them, though other counties may have this as well. None of the jurisdictions I work with do, but Dorchester County has language in their program for administrative variances. They do regular variances too, but administrative variances is a little bit of a shorter and simpler process. And it's to handle more minor and routine activities. And just to address the fact that they needed, because of the, I guess, volume of projects that they were seeing that were similar, they needed something like this to handle those projects. And then in 2017, Dorchester County had a comp review, and it included language to revise their administrative variances. And that basically allowed exact or in-kind replacement in the buffer modified areas to be exempt from the administrative process entirely. So again, that was unique to them. It was based on the local needs at the time. So that's just one example of how we might handle your local needs. So the law requires full compliance with state regulations, even if they haven't yet been adopted in a local program. Our state regulations are the minimum standards. And if there's a conflict between the state standards say and what the local standards say, whichever of the stricter provisions that's the one that applies. Of course, the local government staff coordinates with our commission staff. And right now we have a total of 5 natural resource planners and 2 circuit riders, as well as 2 regional program chiefs, an executive director, a science advisor, a mapping coordinator, and other support staff. Although several of our planners right now are out on parental leave. So there's been a little bit of a baby boom. So what are the rules for development in the critical area? We have 3 classifications or designations for land in the critical area. These were mapped as part of the original critical area program and developed for each county and are based on the characteristics of the existing development. Other areas with development standards include forest and developed woodlands, habitat protection areas, and the buffer. So we'll get into each of those individually next. First up are intensely developed areas, or what we call IDA. These are covered by COMAR 27010203, and they generally occur within cities, towns, and other growth areas with little natural habitat. So one example is Baltimore City. In IDAs, the intensity of the development is regulated by the underlying zoning, and the most important development standard for IDAs relates to stormwater. So water quality must be improved by 10% from pre-development loads for each project. In the IDA, there are no forest clearing limits, but cleared forests should be replaced in order to meet the critical area goal of no net loss of forest. And then additionally, if a site is in the buffer or if there are other habitat protection areas or HPAs that may be impacted, the development must meet the standards that apply specifically to those buffers or HPAs. Next up, we have limited development areas, or LDA, covered by COMAR 27010204. LDAs are characterized by more residential and commercial areas of moderate intensity, as well as some commercial and institutional uses and a variety of habitat. Like the IDA, density in the LDA is regulated by the underlying zoning. However, there are limits to the amount of lot coverage that can be built on a site, as well as the amount of forest that can be cleared. So those standards did not apply in the IDA, but they do in the LDA. Generally, lot coverage is limited to 15% of the area of LDA on a site, and clearing is usually limited to 20% with a 1-to-1 mitigation requirement. In some cases, it can be exceeded, going up to even 30%, and then mitigation also increases to 1.5-to-1, and that's for the entire clearing, not just like the difference between the 20% and the 30%. Just like in the IDA, development on, pretend I didn't say that. Development on steep slopes is prohibited, and development standards related to the buffer and other HPAs also apply. And then one thing to note is that for small grandfathered lots that existed before the critical area program, lot coverage can go over 15%, but we'll get into more detail about grandfathering shortly. So our final designation is resource conservation areas, also known as RCA. And they're covered in COMAR 27010205. They're characterized by farms, forests, wetlands, fields, open spaces, and low density development. Development in the RCA is limited to single-family residential at 1 house per 20 acres, as well as to certain uses such as agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. And generally, new commercial, industrial, institutional, those kind of uses are not permitted in the RCA. The same LDA lot coverage, forest clearing, mitigation, and steep slope standards apply to the RCA, as do the development standards for the buffer and other habitat protection areas. So moving on to forest and developed woodlands, they are covered in COMAR 27, 01, 02, 04. We have a goal of no net loss in the critical area. So we really want to see everything replaced. In the IDA, like we already covered, there is not a clearing limit exactly, but some jurisdictions have incorporated them, but not all. However, we do encourage programs to enhance and protect forest and developed woodlands for their IDAs anyway. And of course, as we previously mentioned, there are clearing limits for development in the LDA and RCA. We'll go over them in more detail later in the presentation, but I think we're already familiar with this general concept of there being a 20% clearing limit with it replaced at a 1-to-1 ratio. So now grandfathering, it's covered by COMAR 27, 01, 02, 07. Basically, we have grandfathering provisions for parcels or lots that were created prior to the law, recorded before December 1st, 1985, or the local program approval. So these lots and parcels can still be developed with a single family dwelling, but they also must comply to the maximum extent possible, and critical area development standards still apply to new development. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Mike and get into habitat protection areas.
Thank you very much, Alex. Appreciate the very thorough beginning to our presentation. Everyone bear with me. I'm somewhat technically challenged on occasion, and I'm still working on my second cup of coffee. So can you see my screen?
Yep. Looks like it's loading presenter mode. You're good.
Good. All right, cool. Now let's just hope it actually goes as planned. Everybody still with us? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. Hopefully.
We're still tuned in. Thanks, Mike.
We did. All right. So now we're going to transition into talking about some HPAs. These are covered in a bit more detail in COMAR 270109. HPAs can occur in all three critical area designations, IDA, LDA, and RCA. These are protected from development, and how they're protected can be done in a variety of ways. The buffer has some very specific requirements that are laid out in COMAR, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail over the next several slides. Non-tidal wetlands are regulated by MDE, but they may also be regulated by local jurisdictions. So it's important to take a look at your code there. And sorry about that. And if there is something that's going to come into us that has anything to do with MDE, it's really important that we try to get some pending tracking numbers. So that way, if we're approving a project or something like that, we can make sure that the left hand's talking to the right hand, so to speak, and any approvals from MDE are also going to be satisfied, since in some cases we do have some overlapping jurisdiction with MDE. It's also kind of important that of all the habitat protection areas listed on this slide, forest interior dwelling birds, FIDS habitat. There are some very specific guidelines and recommendations that have to do with FIDS habitat if you're looking at the development impacts to the habitat. So very important to call these out on site plans and to just coordinate with someone in our office in terms of what's allowed and what kind of mitigation you might have to follow for that.
Hey, Mike, you somehow got muted.
like I said, somewhat technically challenged sometimes. How about now? Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
All right, thank you. So we're going to move on to the buffer. So, studies have shown that the ecological importance of buffers in terms of erosion control, protection from sediment and nutrient runoff, and wildlife habitat. Hence, this is why we have specific provisions specifically for the buffer. The buffer and the expanded buffer must be field delineated based on the edge of tidal waters, tidal wetlands, and tributary streams. Tributary streams include both intermittent and perennial streams. Any property that falls within the limits of the buffer or the expanded buffer is subject to development standards for the buffer. So mitigation is required for the square footage of disturbance, plus additional mitigation for any canopy cover that's removed. So the expanded buffer, the buffer can be expanded for continuous sensitive environmental features. Can I get some feedback in terms of what may cause a buffer expansion for a project? Anybody know? Anybody have any guesses?
You can either unmute yourself and call it out or use the hand function. Oh, there you go. Cassie put into the chat steep slopes.
Cool. Great. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just like with Alex. I can't see myself or the chat.
Nope, that's okay. I'll be your eyes. Cool.
Thanks. Yeah, steep slopes is one that we see often. I work with Calvert County, so I see that a lot in Calvert County. So you can look at the edge of non-tidal wetlands is another one. Hydric or highly erodible soils will cause the buffer to be expanded as well. When we get to steep slopes, there's a formula in there that you have to look at. Anything that's greater than 15% in terms of the steepness of the slope, you will expand the buffer 4 feet for every 1% of steep slopes. When you're looking at non-tidal wetlands or the edge of hydric and highly erodible soils, you'll come to the edge of that or 300 feet, whichever is less. And the big thing about this is that buffer expansions are often, they're very fluid, no pun intended. So they're project by project and site by site basis. So it's very important that if you have questions about how to properly expand the buffer and you review COMAR and you still need a little more guidance, contact our office so we can do our best to help out with that and provide necessary guidance to make sure the buffer is expanded properly, and we're looking at the overall impacts and mitigation. Buffer needs to be expanded to a minimum of 200 feet for all new subdivisions or site plans that are proposed in the RCA. That buffer can also be expanded beyond the 200 feet. Note that lots platted before January 1st, 2010, where the expanded buffer encompasses more than 75% of the lot, there may be development in the expanded buffer with lesser mitigation requirements. Buffer establishment applies to any site that contains a buffer or expanded buffer. And this chart can be found in COMAR 27010901-1. Basically, it requires that some amount of planting be provided in the buffer for development that occurs outside of the buffer. New subdivisions or change in land use requirements require full buffer establishment. Lesser amounts may be required for development or on grandfathered lots or lots with existing development. Excess buffer establishment can count towards mitigation. So if you have a project where both are required, your buffer establishment can kind of help with the overall mitigation requirement. So if you have any questions about that, please reach out to us. And once the buffer is considered fully established, then the buffer established requirement is considered met. Now, the chart that you will find in COMAR is the buffer mitigation. Buffer mitigation applies to any development activity that is permitted in the buffer or the expanded buffer. A lot of them are listed here. It includes building permits, grading permits, variance, shore erosion control, water-dependent facilities, etc. The amount of mitigation required is based on the specific activity. As you'll see on the chart, riparian water access may have 2 to 1, variance is 3 to 1, a violation is 4 to 1. So it will depend on what is being done in the buffer. But take note that any sort of clearing that is not considered temporary is considered a permanent impact and therefore will require this mitigation. Touching on buffer management areas, which is COMAR 27010901-8. These have a variety of different names to them. Buffer management area, modified buffer area, buffer exemption area, special buffer area. They all kind of mean the same thing. This is where local jurisdiction may request an exemption on certain portions of the critical area buffer from the established buffer requirements where it can be sufficiently demonstrated that the existing pattern of residential, industrial, commercial, or recreational development prevents the buffer from fulfilling its function. This example here is from Queen Anne's County. The red line indicates the BMA. The blue line is a shoreline. The green line represents wetlands. Typically, buffer development standards that you'll find in COMAR will not apply to BMA. However, if an exemption is requested, then a local jurisdiction has to propose some other measure for achieving the water quality and habitat protection objectives of the critical area law. Setbacks are always something that's part of BMA. Typically, they're between 25 and 50 feet, and no development is permitted within that setback. And the mitigation is typically 2 to 1 for any development that is outside of the setback, but still within the 100-foot buffer. Now we're going to look at some project review and how to review plans based on various development standards. If any sort of development is proposed in the critical area, it needs some type of review by our office. Depending on the development, it could go further up the chain and have full commission review and approval. Includes everything from site plans to subdivisions and all the things that you see listed on this slide. Some of this information is going to be a review of what Alex already went over, and we'll touch on it in a bit more detail, but we just feel like it's important to kind of drive a point home on some of these things so that if you have any questions, it will be kind of lingering in the back of your mind. So here we have the land designations and what are some of the main points that we look for in project review for the critical area. The development standards vary depending on the size and the type of the proposed project, as well as the location and the characteristics of the project site. But if we're looking at IDA, stormwater, something that we focus on, LDA and RCA, lot coverage and clearing is important. Specifically for the RCA, we're looking at RCA use and density requirements. And then we're going to need something about mitigation if there's a disturbance proposed in the buffer or if there's any forest and developed wooded clearing. Okay, so looking at residential projects in the IDA and stormwater management. Residential projects that involve an impervious surface less than 250 square feet are exempt from the 10% pollution reduction rule requirement. Though it's recommended the applicant still tries to satisfy something by planting trees or shrubs to compensate for site impacts and excess stormwater. If the project disturbs between 250 and 5,000 square feet, phosphorus reduction rule is triggered. There are various non-structural stormwater best managed practices that can be put into effect on site to help fulfill the requirements. Rain gardens, pervious pavers, swales, submerged gravel wetlands. There's a whole bunch of them. Usually, sometimes you can just plant some trees and shrubs, and that will also satisfy the requirement. The spreadsheet that we have online, which we'll try to show you, the link at the bottom of the page will take you to our stormwater management page. Let me see if it works without completely derailing this presentation. All right, so this is our stormwater and water quality page on our website. If you click,
hey, Mike, we're just seeing your presentation still.
Ah, man. Okay. All right. Well, jot down the link, and that'll take you to our stormwater management page. And on that page, you will see a tab for the IDA 10% stormwater management spreadsheet. The spreadsheet has various options for how you can calculate the pollution reduction requirement. It's important that if you have a consultant or someone filling out this spreadsheet, that they actually make sure they send us the actual spreadsheet so that we can look at how they arrive at various determinations. Don't just send us the calculation summary tab or a PDF, because we have to make sure that everything is on the up and up. So that's just kind of a side note. If you are looking at using plantings to try to satisfy some of the requirements, the standards may be changing in the future, but typically the minimum of 3 trees or 9 shrubs can be planted for every 100 square feet of proposed development. And the overall development guideline is that you can have for 2 pounds of phosphorus reduction on 1 acre planted, you should have about 400 trees per acre. But again, that may be changing, so keep close eye on that as time goes on. Projects with over 5,000 square feet of disturbance must have an approved stormwater management plan that complies with environmental site design and as required by a local stormwater management code. I was talking a lot on that. Are there any questions for like stormwater management in the IDA and the ESD spreadsheet? All right, moving on. Looking at residential projects in the LDA and the RCA, lot coverage is a big thing that we're going to look at. Lot coverage is considered any man-made surface, including structures, parking areas, roads, driveways, stairs, walkways. Also includes any areas covered by gravel, stone, oyster shells, pavers, porous concrete, or any man-made material. I know sometimes there could be some debate about whether like a gravel driveway would count toward lot coverage. It does. It does not include mulch pads, decks that are constructed in a way that will allow water to pass freely through them, and fences or walls that are less than 1 foot wide or not constructed with a footer, or walkways and stairs in the buffer that provide access to a pier. It's important to check your local ordinance for specific language regarding lot coverage provisions. As Alex mentioned earlier, there can be some specific language in your code about lot coverage that may allow for lot coverage trading or some exemptions. I believe Dorchester County has some stuff in their code that has like a lot coverage trading system that they can use. So beyond using this chart as a very helpful resource, make sure that you double check and look for specific language in your code. As we look at residential projects in the LDA and the RCA and touch on forest and woodland clearing limits, reforestation is required for all clearing. The main point about this slide that we like to emphasize a lot is that when you're looking at these ratios, sometimes people try to get creative with what's said on here. If you have clearing above 20%, it is 1.5 to 1 mitigation for the entire amount. So, for example, if you have 28% clearing, it is all 1.5 to 1 for 28%. It's not 20% at 1 to 1 and then 8% at 1.5 to 1. So we've had some creative consultants sometimes try to argue that point, but it is all for the total amount. In areas of development or redevelopment where no forest coverage existed prior to the development, like when a new subdivision is platted on agricultural lands, 15% of that area must be planted with trees. So there's a 15% afforestation requirement. For some jurisdictions, this may also apply to the IDA. So check your local program to see if there needs to be tree planting in the IDA. Looking at residential projects in the RCA, more information on this for COMAR 27010205C. We do have additional development standards that apply to projects in the RCA specifically because it's the most tightly regulated of the 3 land designations in the critical area. New development is limited to residential uses and uses associated with resource utilization activities. In general, new commercial, industrial, and institutional uses are not permitted in the RCA. So if there is a new proposed use that is not listed in your code, it must be submitted, reviewed, and approved by the commission. I know that Dorchester County has a few new uses that are probably going to be coming up in the near future for their RCA use list, and Anne Arundel County actually has one that's going to be coming to the commission within the next meeting. So it happens frequently, provided there's justification for it. The commission will usually look at it favorably as long as it meets the criteria of the RCA. Looking at residential density for new development, including subdivisions, It is limited to one dwelling per 20 acres. The regulations do not require 20-acre lots. In fact, we do encourage clustering of development. This, like a well-designed clustering development at a 1 per 20 density, helps to ensure the RCA is maintaining its natural character, allows for the continuation of resource-related land use while avoiding fragmentation of important wildlife habitat. In the case of subdivisions, it's important to accurately research and track subdivision history so that density can be calculated correctly and ensure density requirements are being met. Density should be calculated based on the grandfathered parcel size because of clustering. Sometimes you can't rely on the absolute acreage numbers. Ideally, the RCA land use to create cluster density has been restricted through old plats, but this isn't always the case. So it may require a little bit of digging and looking at stuff that's on record. So if there are questions about that, we can coordinate and try to find some of the history behind certain subdivisions and plats that are out there. There are also limits on how non-conforming lots in the RCA may be reconfigured or consolidated. So look at COMAR 27010208 if you have questions about lot consolidation and reconfiguration. This is like one of my favorite slides because of Zoolander. Hopefully I'm not dating myself by knowing what this movie is. Residential projects in the RCA, looking more at ADUs, accessory dwelling units. Information on this can be found in Natural Resources Article 8-18081E2I. This is an opt-in provision that's typically found in the supplemental use standard of a local code. So check to see if this applies to your jurisdiction or not. There are various provisions and restrictions that will apply to accessory dwelling units, which are listed here, such as being served by the same sewage system as primary unit. It's within 100 feet of the primary unit and doesn't exceed 900 square feet. So just double check your code to see if this will apply. Looking at intrafamily transfers, we see these in a lot of different jurisdictions. I know they apply in Dorchester. A lot may have this provision in their program in order to facilitate, or a jurisdiction may have this provision in their program to facilitate intrafamily transfers. It's an opt-in program. Eligible parcels must be on record March 1st, 1986 in Chesapeake Bay Critical Area or June 1st, 2002 for Atlantic Coastal Bays. These can only go to an immediate family member, which is defined as a father, mother, son, daughter, grandfather, grandmother, grandson, granddaughter, or sibling. The addition of sibling is somewhat new to language. These apply to a parcel that is at least 7 acres and at most 12 acres, and that means it can be subdivided into 2 lots. The parcel is at least 12 acres or at the most 60 acres. It can be subdivided into 3 lots. All of this information should be stated on the final plat. It just requires a little bit more thorough review. So coordinate with us if you have an interfamily transfer so we can make sure everything we need is on that and we don't have to have the consultant and the property owner have 10 different renditions of a site plan to get all the information that's required. So Susan is going to touch on buffer management plans in a little bit more detail.
Excuse me. Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
So on the interfamily transfer, so if the parcel was created prior to that date in 1986, then the interfamily transfer regulations do not apply.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, 99% of the time. There may be a very slight variation of it. I believe I just looked at a case in Dorchester County that's kind of an anomaly, and but 99.9% of the time, yes, that is the case. It'll not qualify to be eligible for an IFT if it is not on record before March 1st, 1986. If you have any questions about that, again, just reach out to someone in our office and we can hash it out. So again, looking at buffer management plans, Susan's going to go on to this in the next part of the presentation. Buffer management plans required for any project that involves buffer establishment or mitigation for disturbance in the buffer. There's a whole list of various reasons why we would need a buffer management plan that's on this slide. It is not required for maintenance on existing grass, lawns, or for gardens. We do get that question sometimes in the office. So little stuff like that will not require a BMP. And with that, I will stop flapping my gums and thank you. If you have any more questions, please reach out to one of us, and I will hand it over to Susan. Thanks.
There we go. All right, so we will now delve into the coordinated review process for local government projects. So first, we'll define what a local government project is. We'll review the various project types, including projects of local significance, major development projects, and conditional approval projects. And we'll also describe the review process for each of those types. So what is a local development project? It's development or land disturbing activities that are sponsored by a county and are proposed on county-owned or private land. All local government projects require review for compliance with local critical area regulations. The type of review depends on the scope of the project. If no land is being disturbed, or if only existing structures are being impacted, our office does not need to see it. Projects that result in minor land disturbance, also known as projects of local significance, require staff-level review with a consistency report. Projects that result in major land disturbance or are not consistent with the local critical area program require full commission review. So projects of local significance include development that is minor in scale, has environmental impacts that are confined to a specific parcel or immediate area, is consistent with the local critical area program, and does not meet the definition of major development as in COMAR or in your code. So projects of local significance are reviewed by commission staff through a consistency report. It's up to the local jurisdiction to determine if a project is consistent with the local program. And by submitting a consistency report to critical area staff for review, it is our understanding that the project is already consistent with the program. So I will now turn it over to Charlotte to walk through the consistency report itself. So let's see.
Thanks,
it's
Annie.
downloading.
Awesome.
Okay, great.
Okay, so as Annie said, local jurisdictions must submit projects of local significance to commission staff with verification that the project is consistent with their local critical area program. So these projects would include any project done by a local jurisdiction on land owned by that jurisdiction or on privately owned land. The consistency report form may be used by local jurisdictions to streamline their submittal of these projects. As you see, the consistency report requests just basic information regarding the project, such as the name, the location, and the critical area designation. The project data section is where you, the local jurisdiction, are verifying that the project is consistent with your critical area program. The project must meet the vegetation clearing and lot coverage limits for its critical area designation. If there's vegetation cleared, adequate mitigation must be provided. If the project is located in the IDA, it must meet the critical area 10% pollutant reduction requirement. And the lower half of this section is where you address whether or not the project meets the habitat protection area requirements in the local critical area program. This would include impacts to the critical area buffer for water-dependent uses only. As noted on the form, impacts to the buffer for non-water dependent uses may require a conditional approval, which Annie and I will be covering later in this presentation. However, commission staff have determined that some minor impacts to the buffer for non-water dependent uses may be reviewed under a consistency report. Therefore, we recommend early coordination with commission staff in order to make this determination. Local projects must also submit a request to the Department of Natural Resources, Wildlife, and Heritage Service for review of all other habitat protection areas. If other HPAs are found on site, the local jurisdiction must meet all development criteria recommended by Wildlife and Heritage Service for that habitat protection area. If FIDS habitat is found on site and there will be impacts to that habitat from the proposed local project, the project may be bumped into a conditional approval. Again, early coordination with commission staff is recommended, as well as early review by Wildlife and Heritage Service. The consistency report form should be signed by the local planner who is submitting the project for review by commission staff. After that planner has reviewed the project themselves and verified the information is correct and the project is consistent with the local critical area program. This form should not be signed by a consultant. The consistency report form should be submitted along with site plans, including planting plans, buffer management plans, and stormwater plans, as well as the Wildlife and Heritage Service letter to our Critical Area Commission admin email. This form can also be found on our website.
All right, great. Thanks, Charlotte. So on this slide, we just have a few examples of some projects that we've reviewed under a consistency report that were submitted by a county or a town. So just wondering, does anyone else have an example that they've recently either reviewed or plan on submitting for consistency? Anyone? Anyone? Okay. Well, I mean, these again are just some like typical examples. I know I personally have reviewed a couple like wastewater treatment plant projects. And there's also been an interesting one in the town of Greensboro that they've been working with Caroline County staff with for a stormwater retrofit at their local fire station. So it's been a fun project to look at because it incorporates a lot of different components with stormwater management, but also invasive removal. So it's just interesting. So moving on to projects that require commission review. There are two types of local projects that require full commission review: major development projects and conditional approval projects. We'll go into more detail in a few slides, but to sum up, major development projects are large projects that are consistent with the county's critical area program, but will result in significant impacts in the critical area. Conditional approval projects are those that are not consistent with the criteria and requirements outlined in the county's critical area program. So any project that requires full commission review, including major development and conditional approval projects, must submit the information and materials listed in the local project checklist, which is posted on our website. But I will now hand it over to Charlotte again to review the components of the checklist.
Thanks, Annie. So as Annie said, this checklist can be used for local projects submitted to the commission for full commission approval. So that is basically a step above the consistency report submittal that we just discussed. This checklist provides very specific, detailed instructions on exactly what is needed for a submittal of a local project that will come before the commission. This would be either a conditional approval or a project of major significance, as well as how to submit that information to us. The biggest thing I want to point out here is the public notice requirement, because this is usually what delays these projects coming to the commission, if anything does. So public notice is required for any project requiring approval by the full critical area commission. So either a conditional approval or a project of major significance. Public notice must be published for 1 business day in a local newspaper and must provide at least 14 days for public comment from the date of that notice being published. And signage must be posted on the site of the project from the day the public notice is published in the newspaper until the project comes to the commission for approval. So in order to have 14 days of comment period available to the public, the newspaper notice needs to be published, 2 to 3 weeks out from the date of the commission meeting. So like I said, this is usually what delays projects most often, is just not getting that public notice published. And I know that some newspapers, in order to get your notice published, you have to submit it to them a certain time, in a certain time frame before the date you want it published. So there's a little bit more planning required for that part of the submittal. So otherwise, as Annie scrolls through this, you'll see that it is literally a checklist. You can take your submittal documents and just go through this and just make sure you have each of these listed pieces of information that's required. It's everything from like what should be on the site plan, what, the buffer management plans, information regarding HPAs on the site, stormwater mitigation. It's very detailed. So hopefully, as long as you kind of review this, and obviously not all of this will be applicable to every project. So there are some things that may be NA, but otherwise, as long as you go through everything on here and ensure that you've addressed it with your project submittal, you should be good to go as far as getting us a complete submittal. And then finally, the last page just shows you how to submit it, either hard copy by mail, or I would say at this point, preferably by email to our admin email address. And then attachment A is just the regulations in COMAR that apply to the public notice requirement. And then attachment B is a list of our commission meeting dates and then the submittal deadline to be on the agenda for that commission meeting. And then finally, there's a planting agreement that should be submitted that basically verifies, that the mitigation for the project will occur.
Okay, awesome. Thank you again, Charlotte. And so just to reiterate what Charlotte already mentioned, public notice is required for projects that go to the commission for a vote. It is not required for projects of local significance that are reviewed via a consistency report. So just keep in mind, public notice must be posted in a local newspaper and at the project site, and the specific posting requirements can be found in COMAR and also in that checklist that we just reviewed on the website. So now we'll take a closer look at the difference between a major development and conditional approval project. So first, a major development project is larger in scale and scope than a project of local significance. It may have statewide, regional, or interjurisdictional impacts. It has environmental or economic effects within the critical area and will have substantial impacts on the county's critical area program. And as mentioned before, it is consistent with the program, but due to the reasons noted above, must come to the commission, the full commission, for a vote. So here again are some like basic general examples of projects that have come to the commission. Just wondering, again, do you all have any examples that you may have reviewed or are going to be bringing to the commission in the future? Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's like, again, some other examples that I've dealt with has been like intersection and like bridge expansions and highway work. I know we saw one last year, I think it was a elementary school addition. So they were expanding like the kindergarten wing. So I think that was in Anne Arundel County. So the county had to come to the commission for review and approval.
Yeah, so Annie, I do one quick example. I know in Wicomico County, I think Cassie's here. They are working with Susan right now on a conditional approval for a middle high school renovation.
Gotcha. Sorry, my dog is barking now. She's been quiet all morning.
Yes, Cassie and I have been working together on looking at Mardella Middle High School project. It will be presented to the commission at the April meeting. And I'm sure, as Cassie would attest, we have had quite a bit of back and forth, many emails, with that checklist and everything, needing to be, either checked or, like, as Annie mentioned, some of it is NA depending upon or, what the specific project is. But yes, we've had a lot of communication. I think it's worked out pretty well. We've I did my best, to respond to Cassie's questions or concerns as quickly as I could, and she's done the same on her end. So that back and forth is really critical to ensuring everything is checked off, everything is taken care care of. And again, to reiterate that public notice, because with the 2 weeks plus, the lag time for putting it in the newspaper, that really does need to get, addressed sooner rather than later. But yes, it's been a great project, and I think we're almost, it's almost ready to go. So I don't know, Cassie, if you have anything you wanted to add to that, or any issues or anything that you would maybe like caution other planners, or any advice to give them, I guess, for conditional approval projects.
She wrote in the chat that it has been a good project. Communication between critical area and the developer has been very important. So
Awesome.
Definitely
Yeah.
second that.
That's great to hear. I'm glad to hear all the, like the back and forth and the coordination, because I know that's definitely key when it comes to these major development and conditional approval projects in particular. So that's actually a good segue into this next section, which is the conditional approval projects. So what that type of project means is that if a state or local agency proposes development within the critical area that does not meet the applicable development standards, the agency may seek conditional approval from the commission. The conditional approval process for local governments is similar to the variance process for private residents. There's certain criteria that a project or program must have in order to qualify to be considered for conditional approval by the commission, which are listed in the conditional approval form that Charlotte will now walk us through. But I do just want to also point out that this form is in addition to the information and materials required in that local project checklist that we just went through. But now, as I'm bringing up the conditional approval form, I'll hand it back over to Charlotte.
Thanks, Annie. Yes, as Annie said, this the conditional approval process is basically like one extra step for a project that requires full commission approval. And a conditional approval is required for any local project that is not consistent with the local critical area program. So basically, it can't fall under the consistency report, because as we discussed previously, that's basically the local jurisdiction signing off and saying, yes, this project meets our critical area program. So if for some reason it doesn't, that's when it gets kicked into a conditional approval request. So this might include a project that is over the allowable lot coverage limit, or proposes to clear more than the allowed vegetation clearing limit, or proposes to impact any of the habitat protection areas listed in COMAR. A conditional approval from the commission allows the local jurisdiction to complete the project, provided specific criteria are met. These criteria are laid out in COMAR 2702-0601, and this form was created based on those criteria. So the first question, B1, basically asks what specific features of the site prohibit the project from meeting all of the critical area requirements. So this might include an explanation that the majority of the site is within the buffer and impacts to the buffer would then be unavoidable, or that the site is currently over its lot coverage limit and overall lot coverage might be reduced, but the site will still be over its lot coverage limit after redevelopment. In the case of the Wicomico County School project we're working on currently that Susan's bringing to the commission, only a portion of that site is actually in the critical area, and that portion is designated LDA. So the project itself is basically going to completely revamp the entire school and surrounding areas, and most importantly is going to provide better egress and ingress for buses and car drop-off and things of that nature. And so that's the portion of the project that's impacting the critical area. So it's that portion of the site that is within the LDA is going to be over its allowable limit, but it's needed for, basically traffic safety reasons. So that's just another example of a type of, an explanation for why a project may not meet its the critical area requirements. So B2 asks what benefits, public benefits, the project will have to the Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Program. So this might include treated stormwater that wasn't treated previously. It might include habitat enhancement being done on site, or green infrastructure projects, or even climate resiliency benefits. And again, just using the Wicomico School as an example, in that case, they are doing stormwater to treat the site that was previously, basically almost, there was no stormwater treatment on the site currently, even though this, there is a school that exists there now. So with the redevelopment, they're going to not only treat what's there, but they're actually exceeding their treatment requirements. And then B3 just asks you to explain the ways that the project is otherwise consistent with the local critical area program. So this might be that the project is meeting the lot coverage limit, but it's impacting the buffer, or it might meet the vegetation clearing limits and won't impact any habitat protection areas, but it is going to be over the lot coverage limit. And that would be the case for this Wicomico project. So then going down to C1, this asks you to explain why a literal enforcement of the local program would prevent the project from moving forward. So basically, you would just explain why the project cannot be constructed if the lot coverage limit or vegetation clearing limit had to be met, or if impacts to the buffer were not allowed. C2 asks for basically, again, the ways that the project does meet the critical area requirements, the process for conformance to the local critical area. So how is the project planning to meet all of the other critical area requirements? And then finally, C3 asks what measures are being proposed to mitigate for impact. So these would be in addition to any mitigation normally required. So let's say the project is going to be over the lot coverage limit, which is why it's coming in for conditional approval. But it's also going to be clearing 25% of the vegetation on site and mitigating it 1.5 to 1 for that clearing. The mitigation for the lot coverage overage, for the reason it requires conditional approval, should be in addition to the mitigation that's being provided for the vegetation clearing. This mitigation for the conditional approval could be in the form of additional planting, so over and above what's required for the vegetation clearing, additional stormwater management over and above what might be required, under MDE's stormwater or our 10% requirement, or other habitat and water quality benefits on site. And again, this form is available on our website.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Charlotte. So again, just to reiterate, conditional approval projects require additional mitigation on top of those general mitigation requirements. So this does give you the opportunity to get a little creative with that additional mitigation that's on top of the regular mitigation. So I guess, is it Cassie, do you mind me asking what the what your project is proposing for the additional mitigation?
She's been using the chat because of her mute issue. So,
And maybe since I've been communicating so much with Cassie on this project too, I guess Charlotte, I think, mentioned too, they're providing additional stormwater management that goes, well above and beyond what is required on site. And that will be, part of the mitigation. And besides even additional stormwater, there are about 9, I think, listed rare, threatened, and endangered species in Barren Creek, which is where the existing stormwater drains off untreated currently. So that will really help to protect that sensitive habitat. So those that's amongst the mitigation that will be provided for exceeding the lot coverage limit. And also, as Charlotte pointed out, it will be meeting all the other requirements for development in the LDA.
Okay, very cool. Awesome. Does anyone else have any other examples of a project that they've brought through under conditional approval? Yeah, all right. We'll just move on for now then. So just to kind of sum up everything, In summary, our most local government projects can be reviewed at the staff level as a consistency report. Major development and conditional approval projects require full commission review and approval, which is a comprehensive process that requires interagency coordination, public notice, and property posting. Early coordination with commission staff is therefore very important in terms of trying to determine which path to take. And just for your reference, here's a link to our website, and then links to those specific forms that Charlotte walked through that are also posted on that website, in addition to the other resources that Susan and Mike and Alex were talking about earlier. So at this point, we just kind of want to open it up to you guys, see if you have any questions or comments or any discussion that you want to have. But that's pretty much it for the slide portion of our presentation today. Thanks for bearing with us.
If you all would rather type questions into the chat, feel free to do that. We can read those out and answer them for you.
I had a question, and I don't have my regs in front of me. So I know that there is, when there is a place in the regulations that talks about the recording of a document and an easement in the critical areas. And I wasn't sure if there is some type of form that is used, or could you just address that one requirement?
Sure. So I think there's a couple places where easements are discussed in the regulation. One is related to like any mitigation that is installed. There's also easements discussed related to protecting forest on site after, after a project is done and there's forest cleared and that's mitigated for, the remaining forest on site gets protected by, easement or other protective covenant. So we do not have a form for that. That regulation, we've accepted multiple types of, protective covenants. It doesn't have to be a formal easement. I know that in Calvert County, they have a fee in lieu program where basically money collected, in lieu of mitigation is given out to like private property owners to plant on their property. And in order to meet that requirement related to like mitigation plantings being put under easement, they have literally like a 1-page form that the property owner who's having plantings done on their property with that money signs and fills out that says, I won't clear these plantings. So that's a very kind of like basic protective covenant that one jurisdiction uses to meet that requirement. And then, it can go all the way up to like a formal easement that's recorded and, documented in the land records. So it kind of runs the gamut. We don't have, unfortunately, an example of that, but Calvert, if you're looking for something that's a bit simplified, the one that Calvert uses might be a good template or a good starting point to look at.
But the easement runs with the land, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Well, then it has to be recorded in the land records, either via a plat or a document recorded in the land records, because how is any future owner going to know about it, and how's the world going to know about it?
Yeah, I'm not sure how Calvert handles that issue at least with the fee and lieu program. That might be a good question to ask Robin in Calvert. Robin McKeisen is their critical area planner there. I can provide you with a contact if you'd like, Marilyn. After
because unless you're going to record it in the land records, then there's no way for anyone to know about it.
Yeah.
So it almost sounds like you have to have a plat recorded that shows the easement, would probably be the easiest way, because the surveyor would have been out there anyway for any kind of site plan. So it almost sounds like just recording an easement with a plat might be the easiest way to do it.
Yeah. I know we've also, sometimes it's something as simple as like a note on the plat that just, and, it's not necessarily an entirely new document, I guess. But that, again, is recorded with the land records, obviously.
Yeah, I can reach out to Robin as well, or just provide contact information so you guys can coordinate offline.
It looks like Cassie has a question. Do you need to submit a project notification form for every project we receive in the critical area, or just specific ones? Alex, do you want to handle that one? I think it was your part of the presentation that covered what gets submitted to us and what doesn't. Could be wrong though.
Sorry, I didn't realize that I had not unmuted myself. I was chatting. That wasn't part of my
Yeah, that
project.
was for me.
Oh, sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
Yeah, so just going back to the slide, project review slide. I guess let me share my screen again real quick. Can everybody see that? I know it's got kind of a weird.
Yeah, it looks like it's just not in like
the
full
presentation
slideshow
mode.
view. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we double check a question. Do we need to submit a project notification form for every project we receive in the critical area, just specific ones? So basically, just like when we were going over this, it's really any project that's going to have impacts in the critical area. You should submit a project notification form. I mean, if it's a little gardening or something like that, then I mean, I've had people call our office and have asked about that because they're concerned and they want to be conscientious about the impacts they're having on the bay. So if somebody's doing a little garden or something like that, that they don't need to. But anything that's going to result in any kind of disturbance, removing vegetation, grading, and even if in some of the cases, if there's like a trail or a pathway that might be going through the critical area or the buffer, we need to review it in our office. It may be something that has to go up the food chain, so to speak, or it could just be something that we can review at the staff level. But typically anything that's going to have impacts will have to be reviewed.
Real quick, Mike, I'll just jump in. So Cassie, what might be useful for you, I'll put this citation in the chat, but 27030104 actually lists out the categories of applications which the commission wishes to receive notification for. So like Mike said, any project, with disturbance in the critical area should come to the county for review, but then there are only certain projects and certain thresholds that warrant being sent to us for review and comment. So I can briefly go through those really quickly. So basically for site plans and subdivisions, we want to see anything in the IDA or LDA that is for a site plan over 15,000 square feet of disturbance. So if it's under that, it doesn't need to be sent to us. And for subdivisions, if it results in 10 lots or units or less, we don't need to see it in the LDA or IDA. In the RCA, we want to receive basically all subdivisions and then site plans that disturb 5,000 square feet or more. So the threshold in the RCA is lower just because it's a more protective designation. And then we should also see anything, any kind of plan or project that impacts any of the habitat protection areas in Comar. That includes the buffer. And then things like rezonings in the critical area or floating zones, special exceptions or conditional uses. We want to see, obviously, any variances in the critical area. And then we are also supposed to review any major buffer management plans that are submitted. So that's anything that is over 5,000 square feet of planting for a buffer management plan. We also would review shore erosion control. You all are probably have gotten emails and comments from our staff coordinated with MDE on the shore erosion control applications in your jurisdictions. And then we also, I think hopefully most of you are aware, we recently updated our regulations to include renewable energy project regulations. So that has also been added to the notification list. So major and minor solar energy generating systems, we would like to see those projects also. So again, I will put in the chat the COMA reference that lists all of that, but that's the maybe not so short list.
On your minor solar projects, what are you calling a minor solar project?
Yep, so that's anything that generates 2 megawatts or less.
And what's your current turnaround time for review from your office?
It should be 2 weeks for a project. If there are delays, let me know. We can work on that. And if you have like a fast turnaround, if you let our planners know that, we can usually accommodate. We do our best. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, on your you said that there was a recent change to the regs where the solar projects are concerned. Can you point me in which reg that is?
Yep. It is COMAR 270114. That's
Thanks.
our new chapter on renewable energy generating systems. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all for.
I'm sorry,
go
can I
ahead.
ask one more question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the recording of this session, is it going to be posted to your website?
We can look into that. I'll talk to our website guru in the office and see if we can do that. Yeah.
My reasoning is because surveyors and consultants need this information. And so
Okay.
it would be nice for us to be able to share with them a link to where they can listen to it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yep, I will email Lisa and Bob now about that. Anyone else? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate it. Hopefully it was not too boring.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Stacey.
Have a good one, guys.